Good greetings, everyone. I will be tackling about the introduction to Rizal's essay, the title, The Philippines a Century Hence, or Filipinas Dentros de 100 Años in Spanish. Okay, so the Philippines a Century Hence is a direct and powerful statement about political prophecy. Simply put, the first a century hence means 100 years from now. So, written by Jose Rizal and originally published in La Solidaridad in 1889. The title immediately tells the reader that this is not a history lesson, but rather a calculated look into the future of the Philippine nations. So, Rizal used this title to establish a clear framework for his analysis. He first examined the past suffering and the current problems being faced by Filipinos under Spanish colonial rule in the late 19th century. By doing this, he set the stage to make sure a prediction about what the Philippines would look like by the late 1900s. So, the title is designed to pose a challenge to the Spanish government. The future fate of the colony rests entirely on their present actions. Essentially, Rizal presented two main possibilities under this title. The first was a peaceful future. If, if Spain reformed its unjust laws and treated Filipinos with dignity, the country might remain a loyal but equal partner. So, the second, more likely possibility was revolution. If Spain continued its corruption and exploitation, the people would inevitably revolt and gain their independence. Therefore, the title itself is a warning, promising freedom, either through reform or force, exactly 100 years down the line. It serves as Rizal's most direct and bold forecast of the nation's destiny. So the context of Spanish colonial rule when Rizal wrote the essay, the Philippines a century hence, around 1889, the Spanish colonial regime was in its final, most troubled stage. The situation was unstable, marked by deep injustice and widespread abuse, which directly fueled Rizal's decision to write a prophetic warning about the future. Okay. The core of the problem was the overwhelming power held by Spanish friars, an unofficial system known as prilocracy, while the civil government in Manila was often weak and constantly changing, reflecting to political chaos back in Spain. The religious orders possessed immense and stable power. They controlled large estates of land, dictated education, and heavily influenced the appointment of officials. This meant that local Spaniards, especially the friars, had the freedom to act corruptly and oppressively, knowing they were untouchable. Filipino calls for reform, like demanding representation in the Spanish Parliament or the Cortes, were constantly ignored because economically and socially, life was harsh for native Filipino. People faced racial discrimination where they were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. Imagine in their own land. Indigenous communities were subjected to forced labor, or polo servicio in Spanish, and forced selling of their crops, or bandala, which essentially amounted to slavery and theft. So, furthermore, the Spanish authorities deliberately limited access to higher education and censored the press, believing that uneducated populace or people would become religious if they become educated. So, Rizal wrote his essay as an educated man Also, is people being systematically stripped of their dignity and the right to take freely. He knew that without drastic change from Spain, this explosive situation could only lead to one outcome, the end of Spanish rule. So, okay, that's all, and thank you.
So, good day everyone. My name is John Faith Julio, and my topic is all about the causes of Filipino misery under Spanish rule. So, the causes of Filipino misery under Spanish rule are multifaceted, including military policies, cultural deterioration, and the passivity of Filipinos during colonization. So the first is the Spain's military policies as a cause of suffering. Spain's colonial administration in the Philippines from 1565 to 1898 relied on military force to maintain control, enforce labor systems like the Polo y Servicio means, forced labor for public works, military campaigns, and galleon trade, and suppress revolts. This led to widespread suffering, military expedition caused deaths, displacements, and famines, as seen in the 1896 Philippine Revolution's brutal suppression. The galleon trade exploited resources and manpower, contributing to economic drain and social unrest, with estimates thousands of dying from overwork, disease, and conflicts. Second is the deterioration and loss of Filipino indigenous culture. Spanish colonization imposed Catholicism, suppressing pre-colonial animistic beliefs, rituals, and social structures through the economieda system and missionary efforts. Native language, arts, and customs were eroded. For instance, the Tagalog script Baybayin was replaced by Spanish, and indigenous practices like tattooing and communal land ownership were discouraged. This cultural assimilation, enforced via education and laws, fragmented identities and fostered a sense of inferiority as documented in historical accounts like those of Jose Rizal, who critique the loss of Filipino heritage. So the last is the passivity and submissiveness of Filipino during colonization. Filipinos' apparently passivity stemmed from Spanish divide and rule tactics, such as pitting ethnic groups against each other and using local elites means principalia as intermediaries, which discourage unified resistance. Fear of reprisals, coupled with gradual culture indoctrination, led to submissiveness. Many accepted Spanish rule to avoid violence, as evidenced by sporadic revolts by the Gohoys 1744 to 1829 uprising that were isolated and crushed. This complacency prolonged misery by delaying widespread rebellion until the late 19th century, allowing exploitation and persist. So in conclusion, Spanish military oppression, cultural erosion, and the passive acceptance of colonization collectively deepened the misery experienced by Filipinos during the Spanish era, impacting their social, cultural, and development political. So that's all about the causes of Filipino misery under Spanish rules. Thank you.
The effectiveness of Spanish colonial strategy to hinder progress. Spanish colonial strategy in the Philippines ultimately proved ineffective at completely hindering the progress of the Filipino people. largely due to internet limitation in the Spanish approach and the persistent resistance it inspired. Instead of fully surprising developments, Spanish approach the persistent resistance it inspired. Instead of fully suppressing development-center colonial policies, Spanish approach and the persistent resistance it inspired. Instead of fully suppressing development certain colonial policies, it created conditions that frustrated intellectual growth and economic disaffection, contributing to the rise of a nationalism movement. The claim that Spanish attempted to keep people ignorant and poor to block progress is a perspective on Spanish colonialism, particularly in the Philippines where Spain ruled for over 300 years. The figure of extermination as a tactic is not a historical event widely discussed in search results, which instead focus on Filipino resilience in the face of disasters, as well as its use and misuse by leaders. However, this praise likely refers to the historical context of the Philippine-American War, where the U.S. military extermination tactics failed to fully suppress the Philippine Philippines resistance due to the resilience and deep community root family-focused resistance of the Filipino people. In some contexts, modern communication technology has undermined the divide and rule tactic by enabling marginalized groups to share information, organize protests, and expose injustice. However, in other instances, the same technology has been weaponized by authoritarian regimes and political actors to amplify divisions, spread disinformation, and tighten their grip on power. Therefore, the tactic is not obsolete but has evolved to exploit the digital landscape.
Now I'm going to discuss about the Rizal's calls for reforms and political change. Sir Rizal calls for reforms and political changes focus on how improving the lives of Filipino under Spanish rule through peaceful and legal means. He did not promote armed revolution but instead sought reforms such as equal rights for Filipino and Spaniard, representation in the Spanish Cortes, freedom of speech and the press, educational advisement, and the secularization of the clergy. Rizal believed that education and enlightenment were the true paths to national progress and liberation. Through his novels No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo, as well as his involvement in the propaganda movement and the founding of La Liga Filipina. He exposed injustice and inspired Filipino to strive for unity, justice, and reform. His ideas laid the intellectual foundation for the later Philippine Revolution. For need for Spanish to change colonial policies compatible with Filipino needs. During the Spanish colonial period in the Philippines, 1965 and 1898, Spain governed mainly for its own benefit. Most policies were designed to maintain control, extract resources, and spread Christianity rather than to improve the lives of Filipinos. Over time, educated Filipino and reformists realized that these colonial policies were no longer suited to the needs and aspirations of the Filipino people. Spain needed to change its colonial policies to make them compatible with the growing needs of the Filipino people. The old system served mainly Spanish interests, keeping Filipinos poor and educated. Without political rights, Filipinos began to demand reforms such as fair taxation, equal treatment under the law, representation in the government, and better access to education to promote justice and progress in their country. These changes were necessary for the Philippines to develop socially and economically and politically. Spain's failure to respond to these needs led to widespread disconnect and eventually to be Filipino revolution. The reforms demanded representation in the Spanish government, education, agriculture, commerce, and individual security. During the Spanish colonial period, Filipino reformists such as Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Jainid demanded several important reforms to improve the lives of Filipinos. One of their main goals was representation in the Spanish government, so the Filipinos could have delegates in the Spanish Cortes and take part in making laws that affected the country. They also asked for reform in education, believing that everyone should have access to quality schooling, not just Spaniards or the rich, and that schools should be free from the control of the pharaohs. In agriculture, they wanted fair treatment for Filipinos farmers who, who often suffered from abuse and unfair land ownership by the pharaohs. They believed that fair land distribution and support for local farmers would help the economy grow. In commerce, they called for more freedom in the trade and business to allow Filipinos to develop industries and improve the country's economic condition. They demand individual security, meaning equal rights for Filipino and Spaniard, as well as protection from unjust arrests, censorship, and abuse by colonial officials. Altogether, these reform demands showed the Filipino desire for equality, justice, and progress under Spanish rule. Although the reform movement aimed for a peaceful change, Spain's refusal to grant this reform eventually inspired the Filipinos to fight for independence. Emphasizes on peaceful reform initiated by government to avoid violence. A classic real-world example of government-initiated peaceful reform to avoid violence comes from India under British rule, especially during the early 20th century. India, India was under British colonial rule. Nationalist movements were growing with protests and unrest against unfair laws, taxes, and limited political representation. The British government feared widespread rebellion and violence. Peaceful reform initiated. The Indian Council Act 1909, also called Parliamentary Reforms, increased Indian participation in legislative council, allowed limited Indian representation in government, aiming to address grievances without resorting to violent suspension. With two later reforms, Government of India Act 1919 and introduced the guy giving chance for say in provincial administration, designed to gradually accommodate national demands and reduce the likelihood of violent revolution. The British wanted to reform the system enough to keep order, avoiding to full-scale uprising while maintaining control.
Hi sir, good day. I'm Heron Rizal from BS Complex. I'm going to topic about Rizal prediction of change in colonial rule. So, Rizal foresaw that Spain control over the Philippines would not last forever. He predicted that another foreign power might take Spain's place as the new colonizer. He questioned whether this new ruler would be another European nation or an Asian power, showing his awareness of global politics during his time. Rizal's insight about the United States as a possible future colonizer was remarkable accurate. He understood that Americans' growing influence and interest in Asia could lead into take control of the Philippines. His prediction partly came true when after Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War in 1898 in the Philippines was ceded to the United States, marking the beginning of American colonization. This shown Rizal's deep understanding of world affairs and his ability to foresee change in colonial power. So, question of which power would replace Spain, European or Asian? Rizal raised the question of which power would take over the Philippines once Spain rule ended. Would it be another European nation or an Asian power? He understood that Spain's control was weakening and that other countries were interested in expanding their influence in Asia. This question showed Rizal's awareness of global political and his concern about the future of the Philippines under a new form of colonization. Rizal's insight about the United States as a potential new colonizer. Rizal showed remarkable foresight when he identified the United States as a possible new colonizer of the Philippines. He observed America's growing power and influence in global affairs and recognized its interest in expanding into Asia. Rizal understood that if Spain lost control of the Philippines, the United States might take the opportunity to establish his Spain defeat. In the Spanish-American War 1898, the Philippines was handed over to the United States, beginning a new period of colonization. How Rizal's prediction partly came true with American colonization. Rizal's prediction partly came true when the United States took control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Spain ceded the country to the U.S. under the Treaty of Paris, marking the end of Spanish rule and the start of American colonization. Although the Filipinos had already declared independence, the Americans established their own government and continued to rule the island for several decades. This fulfilled Rizal's warning that another foreign power, not Spain, would eventually dominate the Philippines, proving his insight about the shift in colonial rule to be accurate. That's all. Thank you.